She was 8 months pregnant. She was sitting at table 1. 2,000 people in black tie were watching. And her husband, the billionaire whose name was on every building, every foundation, every headline, cupped another woman's face in both hands and kissed her. On stage, in front of the cameras, in front of the board, in front of his pregnant wife. The room went silent. Then the applause came back, uncertain, scattered, because nobody knew what to do when the most powerful man in the room made the most reckless mistake of his life in public. But here is what nobody in that ballroom knew. Nobody knew that the empire Harrison Caldwell had spent 9 years building. The holdings, the foundation, the capital structure worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was funded by a web of entities with one single signing authority, his wife's. Nobody knew that while he was planning his next move, she had already made hers. Nobody knew that the woman he had just humiliated in front of 2,000 people owned 63% of his debt and 41% of his equity. He thought grief would make her small. He thought devastation would make her miss it. He was wrong about everything. Stay with me. Because what Vivian Caldwell does next is not what you expect. It is not rage. It is not collapse. It is not begging. It is something far more powerful than any of those things. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why the quietest woman in the room is almost always the most dangerous one. Lesson statement. This is a story about a woman who was told, without words but clearly, that she was invisible. It turns out she had been watching everything, and the moment she decided to stop being invisible, the entire world rearranged itself around her. The lesson is simple, and it is not easy. The power was never missing. It was only waiting. Meaning statement. This story is for every woman who has ever made herself smaller to keep the peace. For every woman who smiled through something that should have broken her. For every woman who was patient for so long that people confused her patience with weakness. Vivian's story is a reminder that being underestimated is not a disadvantage. It is an opportunity, if you know what to do with it. If this story landed somewhere real for you, if you recognized something in Vivian's walk across that marble floor, or in the 4 minutes she stood against a concrete pillar, deciding who she was going to be, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Hit the like button if you stayed until the end. Every like tells us this kind of story matters and helps us reach the women who need to hear it most. Leave a comment and tell us, what was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Was it the parking garage? The boardroom? The second time she stood on that stage? We read every single one. Share this with someone who needs it today. You probably already have someone in mind. Send it to her. And subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories like this every week. Stories about women who were underestimated, women who were patient in the wrong direction, and then changed direction entirely. Women who found out, sometimes the hard way, exactly what they were made of. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss one. We will see you in the next story.
The applause was deafening. It rolled through the Harrington Grand Hotel ballroom like a wave, warm and golden and enormous. The kind of applause that only happens when 2,000 people in black tie have been fed well and given enough champagne and want, collectively, to feel that the world is as beautiful as the room they are standing in. Vivian Caldwell sat at table 1 and listened to it. Table 1 was the founder's table. It sat 12. Tonight it held the foundation's senior board members, 2 city aldermen, the dean of Northwestern's business school, and Vivian. 8 months pregnant, wearing a midnight blue gown that Cecily had spent 40 minutes zipping, and heels she had promised Dr. Brock she would not wear and had worn anyway because some promises are made with full knowledge that they will be broken. Her feet ached, Her lower back had been sending slow, rolling complaints since 2 in the afternoon. The baby had been pressing against her ribs with what felt like deliberate persistence, as if conducting a private investigation of the available space. The sparkling water in her champagne flute had gone flat. The salmon at dinner had been overcooked. None of this mattered, because Harrison was on stage. He was at the podium, wrapping up his keynote address, the one about legacy, about vision, about building something that outlasts you, that carries your name forward into a future you will not live to see. He had given this speech, or a version of this speech, at least a dozen times in the 9 years of their marriage. Vivian had heard it so many times she could have delivered it herself. She knew where he paused for effect. She knew the joke he made about his grandfather's hardware store. She knew the line about his daughter, singular, not yet born, that he had added to the speech 6 months ago, and that still, despite everything, made something shift in her chest when she heard it. She was mouthing along to the grandfather joke when Simone Ashford walked onto the stage. Vivian stopped mouthing. The program listed Simone Ashford as Director of Strategic Partnerships. Vivian had read the title. She had not thought about it much. There were 37 directors of something at Caldwell Holdings. She could not be expected to track all of them. But she tracked this one now. Simone Ashford was 28 years old, and she moved across the stage with the particular confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and has chosen her shoes accordingly. Dark hair. A red dress that the room noticed. She reached the podium. Harrison turned from the microphone. And then, in front of 2,000 people, in front of the board of directors, in front of the cameras that were streaming live to the Caldwell Foundation website, in front of Vivian at table 1, Harrison, Caldwell, cupped Simone Ashford's face in both hands and kissed her. Not a cheek kiss, not a congratulatory brush of lips that could be explained away. He kissed her the way Vivian remembered being kissed, a long time ago. The room went silent for exactly 1 second. Then the applause came back, uncertain and scattered, the sound of 2,000 people deciding simultaneously how to behave when they do not know what they have just witnessed. People looked at the stage. People looked at each other. People looked at table 1. Vivian did not move. Her champagne flute sat untouched. The sparkling water had gone entirely flat now. Cecily, seated to her left, had gone so still that Vivian could feel it. That particular quality of a person holding themselves completely motionless because any movement might make something worse. Under the table, Cecily's hand found hers and covered it. The baby kicked, hard, once. Vivian looked down at her stomach. She looked back at the stage. Harrison was laughing at something Simone had said into the microphone. His hands were in his pockets. He looked relaxed in a way she had not seen in months. He had not looked at table 1 once. She picked up her clutch. She stood slowly and carefully, because 8 months pregnant in heels on a polished floor requires attention, and she was not going to fall down in front of 2,000 people on top of everything else. She straightened her gown. She smoothed the front of it with both hands. She smiled at no one in particular, because a Caldwell woman does not make a scene. Not here, not tonight, not in this room, She walked out. The clicking of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound she allowed herself. The corridor outside the ballroom stretched 200 feet to the elevator bank. Vivian walked every inch of it without stopping. A waiter stepped aside with a tray of champagne flutes. A woman in a silver gown glanced at Vivian's stomach, and then at her face, and then looked quickly away. A security guard near the elevator held the door open without being asked. "Ma'am, are you—" "I'm fine," Vivian said. Thank you. She got into the elevator. The doors closed. She looked at herself in the mirrored panel. 8 months along. Midnight blue. The heels she had promised not to wear. Her face was very still. Her eyes were very bright. The elevator descended. She thought, I knew. Not the way you know facts, the way you know weather. The way something in your body registers a change in pressure before your mind has processed it, before you have language for it, before you are ready to name it. She had felt it for months, the particular chill of something moving under the surface of ordinary life, too slow and too deep to see clearly, but unmistakably present. She had chosen not to look directly at it. The elevator opened on level 3 of the parking garage. The cold underground air hit her like a wall. She walked to the nearest concrete pillar and leaned against it. The cold seeped through the silk of her gown. Above her, through the concrete ceiling, she could hear, very faintly, the string quartet starting up again in the ballroom. The world continuing. The fluorescent light above her buzzed steadily. One further down the row, flickered on and off in a slow, uncommitted rhythm. The smell was exhaust and cold air and the particular mineral chill of underground spaces. She stood against the pillar. She breathed. The baby shifted, a slow, rolling movement, a question, or something like one. I know, Vivian said quietly, not to the parking garage, to her daughter. I know. She stood there for 4 minutes. She watched the time on her watch because she needed something concrete to hold on to, and the second hand of her watch was concrete. 4 minutes. Then she allowed herself a different kind of breath, slower from the bottom of her lungs, the way Dr. Brock had shown her. Then she took out her phone. Harrison's last text, sent 3 hours ago. Save me a seat at dinner. Long night. She read it twice. She locked the phone, unlocked it, locked it again. He knew exactly what was going to happen tonight. He knew I was sitting at table 1. He planned it. The thought arrived with a particular quality of clarity, not hot, not panicked, cold, clean, precise. This was not a moment of weakness. Harrison Caldwell did not have moments of weakness in public. He had moments of calculation that he chose to present as other things. She had known this about him since the first year of their marriage. She had chosen to find it admirable. She started doing the arithmetic the way women do. Quietly, systematically, going back through the last 14 months and reassigning meaning to everything she had filed away under other explanations. The February trip to London that ran 10 days instead of 5. The new cologne in March that she had mentioned and he had shrugged about. The way his hand had stopped settling on her stomach at night. The small, easy intimacy that had just quietly disappeared around month 3 of the pregnancy. And she had told herself he was tired, told herself he was stressed, told herself the pregnancy made her oversensitive and reaching for things that weren't there. God. I knew, and I kept choosing not to know. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. The baby moved again, settled. The elevator at the far end of the garage opened, heels on concrete, moving fast. Cecily came around the corner with her shoes in her hand and stopped when she saw Vivian against the pillar. She stood there for a moment. She did not say anything immediately, because Cecily, for all her sharpness, had always understood that the first thing said in a moment like this matters more than almost anything that comes after. How long have you known? Vivian asked. Cecily closed her eyes. Viv? How long, Cece? A long breath. 7 months. 7 months. The baby was 8 months along. Vivian did the arithmetic one more time. She filed the result in the same place she had been filing things all evening. The cold, clear storage space beyond grief, where facts were facts and feelings were things you accessed later when you had the capacity. "I tried to tell you twice," Cicely said. Her voice was careful and pained. "You were so happy about the pregnancy. You seemed settled. I couldn't take that from you." "7 months," Vivian said again. Not accusation, just the weight of it. "I'm sorry." Vivian nodded. She looked at the flickering fluorescent light. On and off, unable to commit. "Does anyone on the board know about her?" she asked. "Warren Pratt knows something is wrong. He's been nervous at every meeting for 2 months, but I don't think he knows the scope." "The scope?" Vivian repeated. Something moved in her voice. Darker and quieter than anything Cicely had heard from her before. Something that made Cicely look at her differently. "Vivian, what are you thinking?" The fluorescent light buzzed. The string quartet above them had moved into something Vivian recognized, a Brahms intermezzo. Slow and complex and beautiful, the world continuing without interruption. "I'm thinking," Vivian said slowly, "that Harrison just made a very significant miscalculation." She pushed off the pillar. She straightened. She smoothed the front of her gown again, the same gesture she had made in the ballroom, automatic and grounding. "Call Gerald. Tell him to bring the car to level 2. She picked up her clutch. "Then call my grandmother." Cicely stared at her. "Your grandmother?" "At 11 at night. She'll be awake," Vivian said. "She always is." Dorothea Prescott answered on the first ring. "I saw the live stream," Dot said, before Vivian spoke. "I was watching." "Of course you were. Are you somewhere safe?" "Parking garage. Cecily's with me." "Good." The Dot pause. The particular silence that meant she was already 3 moves ahead and was deciding which one to share first. "Everything is in place. The question is whether tonight is the night we activate it." "Tell me everything again," Vivian said. "From the beginning." And so, leaning against a concrete pillar in level 3 of the Harrington Grand parking garage, 8 months pregnant, her midnight blue gown absorbing cold from the concrete, Vivian Caldwell listened to her grandmother explain, for the second time in her adult life, exactly what she owned. Cicely sat on the hood of a nearby car and looked at the ceiling and pretended she could not hear any of it. The story, as Dot told it, began 31 years ago. Dorothea Prescott had one daughter, Vivian's mother, Claire. Claire had one extraordinary gift and one devastating flaw. The gift was warmth, the genuine, radiant warmth of a woman who made everyone in a room feel seen. The flaw was that she extended this warmth to men who did not deserve it, and then handed them her financial security along with everything else. Claire married badly twice. She spent 20 years in a slow reconstruction of herself between catastrophes, and Dot watched every moment of it with the careful, agonized attention of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and had not found a way to stop it. When Vivian was born, Dot made a decision. She began to structure, not a trust fund. Trust funds could be challenged in divorce proceedings by a sufficiently determined attorney, not a simple inheritance. Inheritances were traceable and contestable and ultimately limited by the visibility of the asset, something more complex, something distributed across enough layers that it would require months of legal work to untangle, by which point the person doing the untangling would already be too late. A web of holding companies, real estate entities, intellectual property trusts, investment vehicles organized under a private management structure with a single signing authority, Vivian's. When Vivian was 22 and had just met a brilliant, charming man named Harrison Caldwell, who had enormous ambition and a moderately successful family development company, and the particular magnetic confidence of someone who believed entirely in his own trajectory. Dot sat her down. She explained the structure. She explained the philosophy behind it. He's going to go very far, Dot said then. Men like him always do, and they use other people's capital to do it. Make sure yours is the capital he cannot reach. So they built the arrangement together. Harrison's Caldwell Holdings was funded, in its critical early years, through a series of what appeared to be arm's-length institutional loans from an entity called Veramont Capital Partners, registered in Zurich. The rates were favorable. The terms were patient. The covenants were carefully constructed. Harrison had believed for 9 years that Veramont was a passive Swiss investment fund of the kind that existed by the hundreds, holding positions across dozens of companies without personal interest in any particular one. Veramont Capital Partners was Dot's creation. Its beneficial owner, through 4 layers of legal structure and 2 decades of meticulous maintenance, was Vivian Caldwell. Harrison had built his empire on his wife's money. He had done it for 9 years. He had done it with confidence and pride and the complete, unexamined assumption that the capital behind him belonged to strangers who would never interfere. He had never thought to ask where the money actually came from. How much does the structure control? Vivian asked. As of last quarter, 63% of all outstanding debt instruments, 41% of equity through the nominee shareholding arrangements. Dot's voice was even and methodical, the voice she used when discussing numbers, which was the voice she trusted most. If Veramont calls its notes, Harrison has 30 days before a technical default. He cannot refinance without Veramont's cooperation. The covenants prevent new senior debt without consent from the existing majority debt holder. The fluorescent light above Vivian buzzed and flickered. Did you plan for this specific scenario? Vivian asked. I planned, Dot said, for the scenario in which a man with too much ambition and insufficient character eventually chose badly. I have been planning for it since the day you introduced him to me. A pause. I hoped I was wrong about him. I was not. Vivian closed her eyes. She thought about the ballroom, the chandeliers, the applause. Harrison's hands cupping Simone Ashford's face in front of 2,000 people. While the live stream ran and Vivian sat at table 1 with flat, sparkling water and overcooked salmon and a baby pressing against her ribs. She thought about the walk across the marble floor, the click of her heels, the smile at no one. She thought, I have been a Caldwell wife for 9 years. Before that, I was a Prescott. It is time to remember which one matters. When she opened her eyes, something had settled in her face that Cicely, watching from the hood of the car, pretending not to watch, could not quite name, but recognized immediately as significant. I need Fletcher Holt on the phone by 8 tomorrow morning, Vivian said. He's already expecting your call, Dot said. I texted him from the live stream. A beat of quiet. Of course you did, Vivian said, and it was not quite a smile, not yet, but it was the shape of one. The architectural suggestion of a smile from a woman who had just remembered that she was not, in fact, without resources. Go home, Dot said. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow we begin. Yes, Vivian said. We do. She ended the call. She looked at Cicely. Cicely slid off the car hood. She had stopped pretending not to listen some time ago. Tell me what to do, she said. Tonight, nothing. Take me home. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I need you clear-headed and on time. Vivian moved toward the elevator. And Cece? I need you to understand something. What? I'm going to be fine. She pressed the elevator button. Not eventually. Not after a long time. I am going to be fine. I need you to believe that so you can help me instead of grieving for me. Cicely looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. Okay, I believe you. The elevator doors opened. They got in. Gerald was waiting on level 2 with the car running and the heat on because Vivian had trained her household staff with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything else. And Gerald had worked for the Prescott family for 11 years before he ever worked for the Caldwells. He did not ask questions. He drove her home through the October streets of Chicago, through the gold-lit corridors of the Gold Coast, past the lake that was dark and enormous and indifferent to personal catastrophe, and Vivian sat in the back seat with her hands on her stomach and her eyes on the passing lights and thought about everything she was going to do next. By the time they reached the house, she had the first 3 steps clear. She had always been good at planning. She had simply, for a long time, been planning the wrong things. Harrison came home at 2:30 in the morning. Vivian heard him on the stairs. The particular careful tread of a guilty man. Soft-footed, deliberate, hoping not to be heard. She knew this sound. She had been hearing it for months and filing it under other explanations. She was sitting in the kitchen, in the dark, with a cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold. She had been sitting there for an hour. She was not crying. She was past crying, at least for tonight. She was in the clear, cold space on the other side of it, where everything was very still and very sharp. He turned on the kitchen light and stopped. Vivian. He looked genuinely startled. Then his face did the thing it always did when he needed a moment on dumb. It went briefly neutral, and then he assembled an expression from the available options and chose concerned. Why are you still up? The baby? Sit down, Harrison. He sat. He left his jacket on. A man who keeps his jacket on is a man who hasn't decided if he's staying in the conversation. About tonight, he began. I'm not asking about tonight. She looked at him steadily. I'm asking you one question, and I want an honest answer, not because it changes anything, but because I want to know if you're capable of it. He held her eyes. Okay. How long? He looked at a spot on the table. He held it there for 4 seconds. 14 months. 14 months. The baby was 8 months along. Vivian did the arithmetic one more time and let the answer sit. It started 2 months into the pregnancy, 2 months after they sat together in Dr. Brock's office, in the small room with the anatomical posters and the box of tissues on the counter, and heard the heartbeat for the first time. She had reached for his hand. He had given it to her. He had pressed his forehead against hers, afterward, in the parking lot, and said, I can't believe it. I can't believe we made her. 2 months after that, he had started. She nodded. Once. Vivian. I'm not angry, she said. She meant it. The anger had burned through in the parking garage and left something cleaner and harder behind it. I think I've been angry for months without knowing what I was angry about. Tonight just made it official. We can talk to someone, a counselor. I know how this looks, but if you'll let me... You kissed her on stage, Vivian said, in front of 2,000 people and a live stream while I was sitting at table 1, 8 months pregnant. She paused. There's no explanation that addresses that. There's only the fact of it. He opened his mouth. He closed it. I'm going to bed, she said. I'd appreciate it if you used the guest room. Vivian. His voice had an edge now. We have a child coming. We have the foundation, the board, the business. The business, she said, without turning. Yes, we should talk about the business. She set her cold tea mug in the sink. Soon. She walked upstairs. He stood in the kitchen with the light on, and the refrigerator humming, and the clock on the wall marking time with the indifference of clocks. Upstairs, Vivian changed out of the midnight blue gown. She hung it carefully. She stood in the nursery doorway for a moment, looking at the room they had painted together in September. Soft gray walls, a white crib, the mobile, of little wooden birds that turned in the current from the heating vent. She went inside. She sat in the rocking chair that Dot had shipped from the Lake Geneva house. It was an old chair, dark wood, with a slight creak on the forward rock that she had come to find comforting the way you find comforting the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough to know. She did not turn on the light. She sat in the dark nursery and she let the memories come. Because they were going to come anyway. Because you cannot choose not to remember when remembering is what your mind is doing. And the only thing you can do is decide whether to fight it or let it move through you. She remembered the first year, the apartment on Dearborn Street, with the radiator that clanged and the windows that stuck in winter, and Harrison cooking pasta badly on Sunday nights, because he was trying to learn, and they were 24 and 29 and everything was still becoming. She remembered how he looked at her then, like she was something he had found unexpectedly and was not sure yet how to hold. She remembered the wedding, the September light, Dot, in the second row with her pearl strand and her careful face, her mother, Claire, crying through the entire ceremony. Cicely's speech that made everyone laugh and then go quiet at the end when it turned unexpectedly true. She remembered the early years of Caldwell Holdings. The long nights Harrison worked. The way he came home, some evenings vibrating with the energy of something building, something becoming, and she had loved that about him, that particular quality of a man who believed entirely in the thing he was making. She had believed in it too. She had believed in him. The memories came, and they were not only painful, that was the hardest part. They were real. They were good things that had actually happened. Whatever Harrison had become, or had always been underneath the man she married, the good things had also been real. And losing them was its own kind of grief, separate from the betrayal. The grief for what had actually been good. The grief for the version of things she had believed in. She sat in the dark nursery and she let herself feel it. She sat there for 23 minutes. She cried for 19 of them. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She put both hands on her stomach. The baby was quiet now. The deep, still quiet of a child who is sleeping in the warm dark, unconcerned with the complications of the world outside. "I'm going to fix this," Vivian said quietly. "I promise you, not for him, not for the marriage, for us, for the life you're going to have." She paused. "You deserve a mother who knows who she is. I'm going to be that." She sat a few minutes longer. Then she got up, went to bed, and slept 6 hours without dreaming. She woke at 6:47 to October sunlight and the distant sound of Harrison in the kitchen below. She lay still for a moment and listened to the sounds of the house, the coffee maker, a cabinet, opening and closing. The small, ordinary sounds of a man going through the motions of a morning while the ground shifted beneath him. She thought about Simone Ashford. She had been thinking about her in the background of other thoughts since the parking garage, not with rage. The rage had moved through and left, with something more complicated, with the particular attention she gave to things she needed to understand. Simone Ashford, 28 years old, Northwestern finance degree, director of strategic partnerships for 14 months. The same 14 months, which meant the title and the affair had arrived together, or nearly, which meant one had possibly enabled the other, or both had enabled each other, in the way that things do when a man believes he is operating without consequence. She thought about the kiss on stage, the deliberateness of it. Harrison did not do things by accident in public. She had said this to herself in the parking garage, and it had been true then, and it was still true in the morning light. He had cupped Simone's face in both hands in front of 2,000 people and a live stream, and he had known she was at table 1. He wanted me to see it. He wanted me to react. He wanted something from me last night, and I walked out instead. And now he doesn't know what's happening. She lay in bed, and she thought about this until the shape of it became clear. He was trying to force a confrontation on his own terms, put her in a position of personal devastation so that she would be consumed by the emotional dimension of the betrayal and not paying attention to anything else. A woman sobbing over a cheating husband was not a woman reviewing corporate debt structures. He had underestimated her. Men who underestimated her always had. She had spent her adult life trying to understand whether this was something she had invited. The quietness, the patience, the habit of making herself smaller in rooms where someone else wanted more space. And the honest answer was, sometimes yes. Sometimes she had made herself smaller on purpose, for reasons she had told herself were strategic and now understood were also fear. But not today. Today she was going to be exactly the size she actually was. She got up, she dressed carefully, she went downstairs. Harrison was at the kitchen counter with his coffee and the look of a man who had not slept. He turned when she entered. She could see him assembling something, a posture, an approach, the opening line of a conversation he had been rehearsing since 2 in the morning. "Vivian." "Good morning," she said pleasantly. She went to the kettle. "Did you sleep?" He stared at her. "Not really. Did you?" "Yes, actually." She made her tea. "I have a call at 8 and an appointment at 9. I won't be home for lunch." "Vivian." He set his coffee down. "We need to talk. Last night, I know you said you weren't angry, but I know you are, and I think we need to—" "I told you last night that I'm not angry," she said. She turned to face him with her mug. "I meant it, but I'm not performing calm, Harrison. I've moved past anger." She looked at him steadily. "What I am is done. That's a different thing." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. The beginning of the unease she had seen last night, a man starting to sense that the situation is not what he thought it was. "What does that mean?" "It means I have phone calls to make." She picked up her mug. "We'll talk about the business next week. I'd appreciate it if you continued to use the guest room until we've had that conversation." She went to her study and closed the door. She called Fletcher Holt at 8 o'clock precisely. Fletcher had been expecting her call. He had the folder already open on his desk. He had been awake since 6. He had, in fact, been expecting this call for 2 years. Dot had briefed him as a contingency measure because Dot believed in contingency measures the way other people believed in prayer. "Tell me where we stand," Vivian said. Fletcher told her. She listened for 45 minutes. She asked 11 questions. She made 4 decisions. By 9 o'clock, she was in Gerald's car heading north to Dr. Brock's office for her monthly monitoring appointment, and her mind was not on the monitoring. Her mind was clear and precise and moving forward, and she had the particular feeling of a woman who has been waiting for something to become possible and has just discovered that it has been possible all along. The baby was measuring large. 7 pounds already, Dr. Brock said. Her blood pressure was excellent. Her iron was slightly low. She should eat more leafy greens. "You seem different today," Dr. Brock said, making notes. "Different how?" "Settled." Dr. Brock glanced at her. "You've seemed anxious at the last couple of appointments. Today you seem settled." Vivian considered this. "I've made some decisions," she said. "Good decisions?" She thought about Fletcher's folder, about Vermont Capital Partners, about 63% of debt instruments, and 41% of equity and a Swiss registration that had been quietly waiting for 12 years to become what it now was. "Yes," she said, "I think so." She drove to Fletcher's office. She signed the first set of documents at 11:45 in the morning. She was home by 1 o'clock. She made soup. She sat at the kitchen table and ate it alone and listened to the house. The October wind against the windows, the creak of the floors settling, the particular quiet of a large house in the middle of the day. And she felt, for the first time in months, that she could hear herself think, "This is who I am," she thought. Not the woman at table 1 managing her face while the room watched. Not the woman in the parking garage counting 4 minutes on her watch. This. The woman sitting with soup and a clear mind and decisions made and the knowledge of exactly what she is capable of. She had just forgotten for a while. She was done forgetting. The formal notification from Holt, Barrow, and Associates arrived at Caldwell Holdings at 9:47 the following morning. Warren Pratt read it 4 times at his desk before he printed it. He read the printed version twice more. Then he walked down the hall to Harrison's office. Harrison was on the phone. The call ended the moment Warren's face appeared in the doorway. "What?" Harrison said. Warren set the document on the desk. Harrison read it. His jaw tightened. The left side, the tell Warren had learned over 8 years of watching him think. What the hell is Holt, Barrow and Associates? A family law and financial litigation firm, Chicago, 44th floor, 350 North Michigan Avenue. Vermont is a Swiss entity, with a Chicago law firm representing it. Warren put both hands on the desk. "Harrison, we have 63% of our debt instruments held by this entity. If they are calling for a compliance review, we are looking at potential technical default across every major instrument we hold. That is the entire foundation of our capital structure." "I know what it means," Harrison said. His voice was controlled. His face was controlled. But his hand, resting on the desk, was absolutely still. Warren noticed this because Harrison Caldwell's hands were never still. He drummed his fingers when he was thinking. He tapped his pen when he was listening. His hands moving was as constant as his breathing. The stillness of his hand on that desk was the most alarming thing Warren Pratt had ever seen in that office. "Get me every document we have on Vermont. Every loan agreement, every covenant, every communication, all of it. Today. I've already pulled the file." Warren straightened. "Harrison, in 8 years of working with Vermont Capital Partners, we have never spoken to a human being there. Every communication has been automated, document-based. We have no personal contact. We don't know who runs this entity. It's a Swiss institutional fund, with a Chicago attorney representing it, who is listed on the Illinois bar as a family law and financial litigation specialist." Warren paused. "Harrison, who is this?" Harrison picked up his phone. He called Vivian. She did not answer. He called again. Voicemail. Third call. Voicemail. He called her attorney. The receptionist was pleasant and immovable and directed all communications to Mr. Holt's office in writing. Harrison set the phone down very carefully. He looked out the window. 43 floors below, Michigan Avenue moved normally. Taxis, pedestrians, cyclists, the ordinary frictionless motion of a city that had no idea and no investment in what was happening on the 43rd floor. "Warren," he said, "cancel my afternoon." "Everything?" "Everything." Warren left. Harrison sat in his office alone and he thought. He was good at thinking. Thinking under pressure was the skill he was most proud of. The ability to take a complex and rapidly changing situation and map it correctly while other people were still trying to understand what was happening. He mapped it now. Vivian, the morning, her complete calm, the tea, the pleasantness. I have a call at 8. I won't be home for lunch. We'll talk about the business next week. He had read it as a shock. He had read it as a woman processing trauma and presenting a controlled surface because that was what she did in public. He had misread it entirely. He opened his laptop and began searching. Vermont Capital Partners. The registered address in Zurich. A shell, clearly. The kind of structure that existed to hold positions without disclosing beneficial ownership. He had known this, vaguely, and had not thought about it because passive institutional investors were not his concern. They were Warren's concern. He should have made it his concern. He searched. Prescott Consolidated Holdings. He searched. Dorothea Prescott, net worth. He read for 3 hours. By 4 in the afternoon, he had the shape of it, not the full structure. That would take his attorneys weeks to untangle, but the shape, the outline, the 31-year construction project of a woman who had looked at the world, decided that the people she loved needed to be protected from it, and had then quietly built that protection while everyone around her assumed she was simply a wealthy grandmother living on a lake. He closed the laptop. He thought about Vivian at 22, the way she had been quiet in rooms full of people who were louder than her. He had found it appealing. He had, over time, interpreted it as accommodation, as adaptability, as a woman shaping herself to the available space. He understood now that it had been something else entirely. It had been patience. He had been married for 9 years to the most patient person he had ever met, and had spent 9 years confusing patience with passivity. He sat in the silence of his office while the afternoon moved toward evening. He was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely afraid. Not of Vivian, not exactly. Afraid of what he had not seen. Afraid of the gap between the reality he had been living in and the reality that had apparently been operating alongside it all this time, solid and substantial, and completely outside his awareness. He went home. He used the guest room because she had asked him to, and because he did not know what else to do. In the morning, he tried to reach Vermont Capital Partners directly. The registered Swiss number connected to a service. The email auto-responded, both redirected to Holt, Barrow, and Associates. He understood then, with the cold finality of a man who has just identified the full dimensions of the situation he is in, that he had no move. Every avenue led to the same place. Every door opened onto the same corridor, and at the end of that corridor was his wife, who had been there all along. 3 days after the compliance notification, Warren Pratt requested a private meeting with Vivian. She agreed. She met him at a restaurant on the north side. Neutral territory, not the Caldwell offices, not the house. A quiet Italian place, with good bread and tables spaced far enough apart for private conversation. She arrived first. She was 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant, and she had walked 3 blocks from where Gerald dropped her, and she felt, despite the weight and the aching feet and the October cold, entirely well. Warren arrived 2 minutes later. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been awake for several days in a row. He sat down. He ordered water. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not going to pretend I know the full structure," he said. "I've had 2 of our attorneys reviewing what they can access, and they tell me it would take weeks to map the complete picture, but I know enough." He paused. "I owe you an apology." She had not expected this. "What for?" "I knew something was wrong. Not the business dimension of it. The other thing." He looked at the table. I knew something was happening, personally, that shouldn't have been. I saw enough to know. I said nothing. He looked up. You were 8 months pregnant. I told myself it wasn't my place. That's true, and it's also a coward's excuse, and I'm sorry. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. That matters. What's going to happen to the company? He asked. Not defensively, not on Harrison's behalf. The question of a man who cared about 2,000 people's livelihoods and was trying to understand what he was facing. The company is not going to be destroyed, she said. That's not my intention, and it's not in my interest. I have no desire to dismantle something that took 9 years to build. She looked at him directly. What I have is an interest in correcting the governance structure so that it reflects the actual financial reality, and in ensuring that Harrison faces appropriate accountability. Appropriate accountability, Warren repeated. He seemed to be measuring the phrase, looking at it from different angles. That's careful language. I'm a careful person. He almost smiled. I'm beginning to understand that. He broke a piece of bread. He held it without eating it. He thought Veramont was passive. He never asked what it was, Vivian said. He asked what it could do for him. That's a different question. Warren put the bread down. He's going to fight this. You should know that. Not because he has a strong position. He doesn't, legally. But because he doesn't know how to not fight. It's structural for him. I know, she said. I was married to him for 9 years. He's going to say you manipulated him, that the structure was designed to entrap. The structure was designed to protect, she said quietly, by a woman who watched her daughter lose everything twice to men who were given everything and protected nothing. She looked at Warren steadily. It was designed 31 years ago by someone who understood, before I was old enough to understand it myself, that the world I was going to live in required me to be protected from exactly this kind of moment. Warren was quiet for a long moment. The board meeting, he said. When? Second Thursday of October. She picked up her water glass. I'd appreciate it if you attended as yourself, Warren, not as Harrison's ally. As the person responsible for this company's financial integrity. He looked at her, then he nodded, a single, deliberate nod. That's what I've always been, he said. I just forgot it for a while. She understood that feeling completely. The bread arrived, they ate. They talked about the mechanics, the board notification, the compliance timeline, the documentation Fletcher was preparing. They talked like two professionals assessing a complex situation, which was what they were. Cicely texted twice during lunch. Vivian responded to the second one. Still here? All fine. She'll never know what hit him. Vivian put her phone away. On the way home, in the back of Gerald's car, she looked out at the lake. The water was the particular steel blue of mid-October, the color it turned when summer was fully over and the cold had made itself permanent. She had always loved the lake in October. The honesty of it. The way it stopped pretending to be warm. She felt the baby move, a long, rolling shift, an adjustment, a settling. I know, she said quietly. Almost time. She looked at the lake until Gerald turned inland and the water disappeared behind the buildings. She thought about Warren's face when he apologized, the genuine quality of it, the way accountability looked when it was real, not performed, not strategic, but actual. A man examining what he had done and choosing to name it honestly. She thought, that is what I want from Harrison too. Not the collapse of what he built, not the destruction of his reputation, just the acknowledgement, the naming of what was real. She was not sure she would get it. She was prepared to proceed either way. What nobody in this story expected was Simone Ashford. She was 28 years old. She had a master's degree in finance from Northwestern. She spoke fluent French and could read a balance sheet the way musicians read scores. Not just the notes, but the intention behind them, the story the numbers were constructed to tell. She was also, and this was the part that complicated everything, not in love with Harrison Caldwell. She had never been. She was entirely honest with herself about this. Harrison had been a door, a specific door that led to a specific level she had intended to reach by a specific point in her career, and she had opened it with clear eyes and no illusions about the cost. She had been wrong about the exit. She learned about the Vermont situation from an email chain she should not have been copied on, an assistant's error. Corrected in 7 minutes with a recall request, but not before Simone had read every word and saved a screenshot to her personal phone. She sat at her desk for a long time. She was not naive. She understood blast radius. She understood that the people nearest an implosion took the most damage, regardless of their personal culpability. She also understood, because she was very good at reading financial structures, that Vivian Caldwell had been quietly and systematically outmaneuvering her husband for 9 years through mechanisms he had never thought to examine. This was the most impressive thing Simone had ever seen in her professional life, and it told her something important. It told her that Vivian Caldwell was not the woman Harrison had described, passive, emotionally focused, unlikely to cause strategic problems. Vivian Caldwell was the woman who had been running the board while everyone watched the person at the front of the room. Simone had spent 3 years working for the person at the front of the room. She took the elevator to the 44th floor of 350 North Michigan Avenue and asked to see Fletcher Holt. She waited 45 minutes. Fletcher came to the waiting room himself. He had the expression of a man who had been expecting something like this and was reserving judgment about whether it was welcome. Vivian was at Dr. Brock's office when her phone buzzed with Fletcher's text. She was lying on the examination table with the fetal monitor strapped across her stomach, listening to her daughter's heartbeat. Steady, insistent, the most reliable sound in her current life. Simone Ashford is in my office. Willing to provide full written account of 14 months, wants professional protection in exchange. Recommend you come. Vivian read the text. She looked at the monitor screen. The heartbeat line moved its steady peaks and valleys. Steady, steady, steady. She texted back. When? Now, if possible. She looked at Dr. Brock. Am I cleared to drive? Normal restrictions apply. Then I need to reschedule the rest of this. She drove to Fletcher's office. Simone Ashford was in the conference room. Gray blazer. Good posture. The posture of a decision fully made, not second-guessed. She stood when Vivian entered. The two women looked at each other across the conference room. The air held something, not hostility exactly, recognition. Two people who had been in the same story from different positions, now in the same room for the first time. I'm not going to apologize, Simone said. I think we both know that's not what this moment needs. No, Vivian agreed. She sat. Tell me what you know. Simone told her. Harrison's plan, as Simone laid it out, had been 18 months in the making. He intended to restructure the board, bring in 3 new members personally aligned with him, shift the governance so that external debt holders had diminishing influence, and progressively buy out the Vermont position over 5 years once cash flow allowed. He had never questioned who Vermont actually was. Passive institutional investors were furniture. They held positions and received payments and did not interfere. He was going to eliminate the leverage, Simone said, incrementally, so that by the time the company was fully his, no single outside party held enough to matter. And the gala, Vivian said. Simone was quiet for a moment. I didn't know there were cameras on us at that specific moment, she said. I want to be clear about that. He did know. She looked at the table. I think he believed that if you were Consumed by the personal dimension of the betrayal, you would be reactive rather than strategic. That grief would make you focus on the marriage and not the business structure. Vivianson was still. He thought grief would make me miss it. He thought devastation would make me small. He really didn't know, she said, not with contempt, with something quieter and more complicated, the sadness of recognizing how thoroughly someone had misread you. No, Simone said. He didn't. A long pause settled in the room. What do you want? Vivian asked. A letter from your attorney confirming I cooperated voluntarily. A neutral, professional reference. I'll resign from Caldwell Holdings. Simone met her eyes. I have other options. I've always had other options. Fletcher will handle the documentation. Vivian stood. She picked up her bag. She was almost at the door when Simone spoke again. Mrs. Caldwell. She stopped. He talked about you, Simone said. When he wasn't being careful. He used to say you were the smartest person he had ever met. She paused. I think he meant it. I also think he found it threatening and never told you that part. Vivian's hand was on the door. I know, she said. Both things. She opened the door. That night, alone in the bedroom, she no longer shared with her husband. Vivian sat at the edge of the bed and let herself feel everything she had been holding at careful distance for 2 weeks. The grief. Not for the marriage only. For the version of Harrison she had believed in. For the man who had pressed his forehead to hers in a parking lot and said, I can't believe we made her. That man had been real, partially real. Real enough that losing him had its own particular weight. The exhaustion, 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant, running a legal strategy, managing her own household, holding herself together with a composure that cost something every single day, the fear. Underneath everything else, small but present, the fear of what came next, of doing this alone, of being enough. I'm not crazy, she thought. I know exactly what happened. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I am going to be enough for this child. She put her hands on her stomach. The baby moved, a slow, reassuring roll. Almost, Vivian said. Just a little longer. She lay down. She turned off the light. She breathed in the dark until the breathing became sleep. The special meeting of the Caldwell Holdings Board of Directors was called for the second Thursday of October. The formal notice described it as a review of certain financial structures and their implications for future capitalization strategy. Warren had written this language at Fletcher's suggestion. By the time Harrison received the notice, the framing of what was about to happen had already been established by the person who was about to make it happen. Harrison had spent the intervening days attempting to reach Vermont directly. He had called the Zurich number 11 times. He had sent 4 emails to the official contact address. Each call reached an answering service. Each email received an automated response directing him to Holt, Barrow, and Associates. He had briefed his personal attorney, a man named Douglas, who was very good at hostile takeovers and had never handled anything quite like this. Douglas had reviewed what documentation was available and told Harrison, with the careful delivery of a professional bearing bad news, that the structure appeared to be entirely legally sound and that Harrison's options were limited until he understood the full scope of the beneficial ownership. Harrison sat with this information and did not sleep well. He passed Vivian in the kitchen each morning. She was pleasant. She asked if he needed anything. She was cooking again. Simple, good food that filled the house with warmth. And the domesticity of it, the normalcy of it, was the most disorienting thing he had experienced in his adult life. He did not understand how she was doing it. The board convened at 2 in the afternoon. 7 members around the long conference table on the 41st floor. Harrison sat at the head of the table. Habit. Fletcher Holt entered at 2:03. Vivian was beside him. She was wearing dark charcoal trousers and a cream blouse. She looked calm and prepared and entirely composed. She sat in the chair Fletcher held for her. Second from the left, not the head of the table, a position that was itself a statement about the difference between the person who needed to occupy the visible space and the person who already occupied the actual power. She folded her hands. She waited. Fletcher presented. The presentation took 22 minutes. The Vermont structure, the beneficial ownership chain, the nominee shareholding arrangements, the debt covenant provisions, all of it laid out with the clean and complete precision of a man who had been building this case for months and had organized it for maximum clarity rather than maximum drama, because the facts were dramatic enough without assistance. The board members were very quiet throughout. Warren Pratt, seated 2 chairs from Harrison, had the expression of a man watching a building come down in a controlled demolition. The kind where you knew it was coming and you had time to brace, and you still found the reality of it larger than the anticipation. Harrison's hand rested on the table. It was not moving. It had stopped moving somewhere around minute 14 of the presentation and had not moved since. No drumming, no tapping, no pen. Absolute stillness. Warren noticed it. He had been waiting for it to move, and it did not move, and the stillness of it was the most alarming thing he had seen in that room, and he had seen many alarming things. Harrison Caldwell was frozen. When Fletcher finished, there was a silence with weight. Robert Alderman spoke first. "You're telling us that the majority debt instruments and a controlling equity interest in this company have been held for 9 years by Mrs. Caldwell." "That is correct," Fletcher said. "Through structures that Harrison was not aware of." "Also correct." Robert looked at Harrison, then at Vivian. Then he made the decision that experienced board members make, which is to focus on the functional question. "Mrs. Caldwell, what are your intentions regarding the company?" Vivian unfolded her hands. "I intend to protect the company," she said. The room was very quiet. "The 2,040 people who work here are not responsible for decisions made at the executive level. Their livelihoods are not collateral. I have no interest in burning down what has been built." She paused. "I do have interest in rebuilding what has been mismanaged." "And Harrison's position?" "Harrison can speak to his own intentions," Vivian said, without looking at her husband. "But the governance structure will need to be corrected. I recommend the board address that through whatever process they find appropriate." Robert turned to Harrison. Harrison had not spoken. He was sitting very still at the head of a table where he no longer held the power. In a chair he had sat in from habit rather than from right, and his hand was motionless on the table, and his face was the face of a man looking directly at the full dimensions of a situation he had not seen coming and was only now mapping accurately. He looked at Vivian. She met his eyes, just for a moment. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not cold. It was not the face of someone performing victory. It was simply clear. The face of a woman who had stopped pretending to be uncertain about things she was entirely certain about. He looked away first. "I'd like to propose a closed session," Robert said. "Mrs. Caldwell, would you and Mr. Holt be willing to step out?" "Of course," Vivian said. She stood. She was nearly 9 months pregnant, and she stood with the same care and deliberateness she brought to everything bow. No apology for the space she occupied, no performance of diminishment. She and Fletcher moved to the corridor. Fletcher stood beside her, with his hands in his pockets, and looked at the lake through the hallway windows. 20 minutes for the vote," he said. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I'd like to sit down." He found her a chair from a nearby alcove. She sat. She put her hands on her stomach. Through the closed board-room door, she could hear the low, controlled murmur of 7 people recalculating everything. She waited. She had always been good at waiting, in the right direction. The vote took 18 minutes. When Robert opened the door and asked them back in, he had the expression of a man who has arrived at the correct answer and knows it. Harrison would step back from active management during a 90-day governance review. An interim chief executive officer would be appointed by the board. Harrison's equity position was preserved. The governance structure would be formally corrected to reflect beneficial ownership. Harrison said nothing during the readout. He looked at the table, then out the window, then at a point somewhere between the two. His hand, Vivian noticed, had still not moved. After the board meeting, Harrison asked to speak with Vivian alone. She considered it. The hallway, the afternoon light fading over the lake, Fletcher at a respectful distance with his briefcase. She thought about what she wanted from this conversation. Whether she wanted anything, whether it would cost her something she needed to preserve. She decided she wanted to hear what he had to say. She nodded. Fletcher stepped further down the hall. The board members left in ones and twos. Warren paused in the doorway and looked at Harrison with an expression that contained more feeling than he usually permitted in professional settings. And then he was gone. The conference room was quiet. Harrison sat down. He sat differently than he had during the presentation. Not the careful, controlled posture of a man performing authority, but the way tired men sit when there is no longer any performance required. He loosened his tie. He looked at the table for a moment. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About Vermont." "Since I was 22. He closed his eyes, held them closed for several seconds. "And you never told me. You never asked about my family's financial structures," she said. "You weren't interested in where the capital came from. You were interested in what it could do." "That's not entirely fair." "No," she agreed. "It's not entirely fair. Very little about the last year has been." The silence settled between them. Outside, the lake had gone silver and flat in the late afternoon light. A single sailboat, too late in the season, moved slowly toward the harbor. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. The question surprised even him. She could see the small flinch of a man who has just allowed himself genuine vulnerability. The drop of the performance. The actual face underneath. It was the most honest thing he had said in this room, possibly in this year. She took her time with the answer, because the question deserved one. "Yes," she said, "for a long time, and in the way I was capable of at the time. I think you loved me too, in the way you were capable of." She held his eyes. "I think we both stopped being capable of it a while ago, and neither of us wanted to say it first." He nodded slowly. "The baby," he said. "Our daughter. I want to be her father. Whatever happens between us, whatever the business becomes, whatever the legal process, I want to be there for her. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I want." "Then be it," Vivian said simply. "That has nothing to do with what happened in this room today. What happens now, to me, professionally. The board will conduct the governance review. At the end of it, there will be a new structure. Your equity is preserved. You will not lose your financial position. You lose the operational role, and you lose the governance authority." She looked at him directly. "You built something real, Harrison. Whatever else is true, you built something. I'm not going to demolish it." He stared at her, the full comprehension of what she was saying, what she was not doing, what she had chosen not to do, moved across his face slowly. "You're not trying to destroy me." "No," she said. "Destroying you doesn't help my daughter. It doesn't help the people who work here. And it would be—" She paused. "It would be beneath me." He was quiet for a long time. The sailboat had reached the harbor entrance. Almost there, almost safe. "I planned the gala," he said. "I need you to know I know that. I wanted to force a confrontation. I thought if you were focused on the personal—" He stopped. "I thought grief would make you reactive. I miscalculated." "Yes," she said. "You did. I didn't know what I was dealing with." He said it without deflection, without the minimizing, the darvo, the rational reframing she had been braced for. Just the statement, plain and accurate. "I know," she said. "You're extraordinary." The words seemed to cost him something. "I knew it when I married you. I think I spent 9 years trying to make you smaller, so it would be less obvious, less threatening." He looked at her steadily. "That was wrong." Vivian was quiet. Then she said, "Get therapy, not for the marriage. That chapter is closing, and we both know it. Get it for yourself, and mean it. You have a daughter coming. She is going to watch every choice you make for the next 20 years. She is going to learn from it." She picked up her bag. Give her something worth learning from. She walked to the door. "Vivian." She paused. "Thank you," he said, "for not burning it down." She considered this. "Don't thank me," she said. "Earn it." She opened the door. Fletcher was in the hallway. She walked forward. She did not look back. Not because she was angry, not because she could not bear to, but because she had spent 9 years looking back. Looking back to check his expression, looking back to gauge his mood, looking back to make sure she was still necessary, still seen, still enough. She was done orienting herself by what was behind her. She walked forward, and it felt like the truest thing she had done in a very long time. The Caldwell Foundation's Winter Symposium was held 6 weeks later on a Friday evening in November. Vivian was 4 days from her due date. Dr. Brock had said, light activity, no stress. Call immediately if anything changes. Vivian had said, I will give a 5-minute address, and then Gerald will drive me directly home. Dr. Brock had looked at her with the expression she reserved for patients who were going to do exactly what they intended, regardless of medical counsel. She had said, Of course you will. Then, call me if anything changes, and I do mean anything. The Harrington Grand in November was the same building it had always been. The chandeliers, the marble, the particular warmth of a large heated room full of people who believed in the same things, or were working on it. But the stage was set differently than it had been 6 weeks ago. No long gala tables, no black tie seating arrangement, no podium center stage. Instead, theater-style chairs in a wide semicircle and a speaking platform at the front of the room. Smaller tonight, 300 people instead of 2,000. Board members, foundation partners, program recipients, faces Vivian recognized from years of quiet foundation work, from site visits and grant reviews, and the particular kind of meeting that happens when you are genuinely interested in what the money is doing rather than how the giving looks. A handful of journalists, 2 city council members. Cecily was in the front row. She was wearing the green dress she reserved for occasions she considered historic. She had worn it twice before, once at a college graduation and once at an election night party for a candidate she genuinely believed in. She was wearing it tonight because she had decided 6 weeks ago in a Chicago parking garage that this moment was going to happen, and she had been waiting for it since. Her face was doing a complicated thing that she had decided not to manage. Dot was in the second row. Dorothea Prescott, at 82, in her standard winter armor, the dark coat, the single strand of pearls she had worn since Vivian could remember, the posture of a woman who had been told she was too small and too quiet to run anything significant and had built a financial empire in response. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the stage, and her face had the quality of complete, focused attention, which, for Dot, was the equivalent of everything. Harrison was not there. He was in family therapy. He had started 3 weeks ago. He had called Vivian to tell her, not because she had asked him to report it, but because he had decided to be accountable about it and had understood, finally, that accountability was an action and not a statement. She did not know if the therapy would help. She had stopped measuring her expectations against his progress. What he did with the rest of his life was his to determine. Her life was hers. This was the most important thing she had understood in the past 6 weeks. The MC introduced her. 300 people turned toward the stage. Vivian walked out. She was not in midnight blue tonight. She was in deep burgundy, the color of something that has survived cold and emerged changed but not broken. Her hair was down. She was 4 days from her due date, and she walked across the stage the way she had learned over the past 6 weeks to do everything, carefully, deliberately, without apology for the space she occupied or the time she took or the weight she carried. She was exactly the size she actually was. She set her notes on the speaking platform. She did not look at them. 6 weeks ago, she said, I sat at table 1 in this room and watched something happen that was designed to devastate me. The room went very still. And it did. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. The grief was real. The shock was real. Even when you have suspected something for a long time, even when some part of you has been quietly keeping track of the evidence, adding it up, filing it away, the confirmation still arrives with its own weight. Something separate from everything you thought you knew. She paused. I felt that. I sat in a parking garage at 11 at night, and I felt all of it, against a concrete pillar, in a gown I should not have been wearing in a parking garage. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the room. What I want to talk about tonight is not the betrayal. It's what I'm calling the interval. She looked out at the 300 faces. The interval between the moment that breaks you and the moment you're standing somewhere like this, healed enough to stand. Because that interval, the 3 in the morning conversations with your unborn daughter, the cups of tea gone cold because you couldn't stop thinking, the day you sign documents that change everything and then drive home and make soup. That interval is where you find out who you actually are. Several people in the room had gone very still in the particular way of people who are hearing something they recognize in their own lives. I have worked with this foundation for 9 years. I have made decisions about its structure and direction from a position that was deliberate. I worked behind the stage, as it were. I told myself it was strategy. I told myself I didn't need credit. And both of those things had some truth in them. She looked down at her hands on the platform for a moment. But there was also fear in it. Fear of taking up the full space I had actually earned. Fear that being fully visible would cost me something I was not ready to lose. She let that sit. Here's what I have learned in 6 weeks. Being fully visible is terrifying right up to the moment you realize you are already here. You are here the whole time. You are just waiting for permission you never needed. In the second row, Dot closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted in her face. Something released, something completed. Effective today, I am assuming the role of active chair of the Caldwell Foundation. Vivienne placed her hand on her stomach, briefly, without thinking. Our maternal health initiative will expand to 6 new cities over the next 3 years. Our family financial literacy program, the one that teaches women the kind of structural financial knowledge that I personally believe every woman should have access to before she needs it, will become our flagship investment. She looked at the room. I spent a long time being strategically quiet. I spent a long time making myself smaller in rooms where someone else wanted more space. I called it patience. Some of it was fear in patience's clothing. She straightened. I'm done with the fear. The patience I'm keeping, directed in a better direction. She gathered her notes. I want to close with something my grandmother told me a long time ago. She said, the best power is the power no one knows you have. I believed that for a long time. I still believe it, to a point. The point where keeping yourself hidden stops protecting you and starts erasing you. She looked toward the second row. I erased myself for a while. I thought it was smart. It wasn't. It was just quiet. And quiet is not the same thing as safe. And safety is not the same thing as strength. She stepped back from the platform. You were always here. The only question was when you were going to let yourself take up the space. The applause started. It was not the champagne warm, automatic applause of 6 weeks ago. The applause of 2,000 people performing normalcy over a moment of public scandal. This was different. This was slower and more deliberate, and it built from the center of the room outward. The way things spread when they are real. 300 people who understood that what they had just witnessed was not a speech. It was a reckoning. It was a woman standing in the room where she had been publicly diminished and claiming it, permanently, as hers. It built and built. In the front row, Cicely abandoned the fight against the tears she had been holding for 6 weeks. She did not bother to hide them. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at her best friend on that stage and felt, with the complete conviction of someone who has been present for the whole story, that she was watching the thing she had been waiting for. In the second row, Dorothea Prescott stood up. She was the only person in the room who was standing. She stood the way she did everything, with total commitment, without self-consciousness, with the particular quality of a woman who has been waiting for this specific moment for 31 years and finds it. Now that it has arrived, exactly as significant as she always knew it would be. And she smiled. The uncomplicated smile. The one Vivienne had seen only a handful of times in her life. Not the controlled, measuring smile of a woman keeping her assessment private. The real one. The one that meant, yes, this. This is the thing I built toward. Vivienne found it across the room. She held it. Something moved between them. Grandmother and granddaughter. The woman who had built the structure and the woman who had finally inhabited it fully. Across 31 years and 4 layers of legal documentation and one very significant evening in a parking garage. I see you, Dot's face said. I know, Vivienne's answered. I finally do too. 4 days later, Eleanor Prescott Caldwell was born at Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 6:47 in the morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Dark hair, a very strong opinion about being cold. Harrison was in the delivery room. He had asked carefully, not assuming, just asking, giving her the choice. She had said yes, because whatever else was true, this child was going to have her father from the first moment of her life. And that was a decision Vivienne had made for Eleanor, rather than for herself. He held Eleanor for 11 minutes, while the nurses attended to Vivienne. She watched his face across the room. She watched the way he looked at this child. Not the performance of fatherhood, not the assembled expression of a man choosing how to present himself, just the actual face of a man holding his daughter for the first time and being completely undone by it in the particular way that only babies can undo the most defended people. She thought, he is going to love this child well. She thought, whatever else he is, that is also true. She thought, that is going to have to be enough. And it is. It was. Cicely arrived during the second hour and named herself godmother without asking anyone's permission. She named herself with the full conviction of a woman who has already decided and is simply informing the room of the decision. Nobody argued. Nobody who has ever known Cicely has successfully argued with her about something she has decided with that level of certainty. Gerald sent flowers from the car service. Dr. Brock stopped in before her afternoon rounds and looked at Eleanor with professional satisfaction and said, "She is perfect," which Vivian already knew. Dot arrived at noon. She arrived with the cashmere blanket, cream-colored, the softest thing Vivian had ever touched, that she had been knitting since August, in secret, in the evenings at the Lake Geneva house, with the specific patient attention she brought to things that mattered. She had said nothing about it. It appeared at noon on Eleanor's first day as if it had always been there. Dot sat in the chair beside Vivian's bed. She looked at Vivian for a long moment. Busab Tim just looked with the full measuring attention of a woman who had been watching this person for 34 years and was checking something she needed to verify. Whatever she was checking, she found it. She nodded, once. Then she reached for Eleanor. She took her from the bassinet with the easy authority of a woman who has held many babies and understands that they need to be held as if you mean it. She sat with Eleanor in the chair beside Vivian's bed. She looked at this child. The dark hair, the small tight fists, the face that was entirely new and entirely belonging, with the complete attention of a woman meeting someone she has been expecting. "Well," Dot said. She held Eleanor for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the hospital room floor. Outside the window, Chicago continued in its ordinary way. Traffic, sky, the lake in the distance, going from blue to silver as the light changed. The world continued, as it always does, without pausing for the significant moments happening inside its buildings. "You're going to be extraordinary," Dot said finally. Not a wish, not a prayer, a statement of fact, delivered to an infant with the calm precision of someone who knows things. The women in this family always are. She looked up at Vivian. "She has your chin," Dot said. "She has your stubbornness," Vivian said. Dot considered this. "Yes," she said, with the unhurried satisfaction of a woman who considers this the most valuable inheritance she has to offer. "She does." Eleanor considered the light and the warmth and the voices and the cashmere and the general complicated fact of being in the world. Then she decided she had processed enough for one day. She closed her eyes. She slept. Editorial disclaimer. The content in this story, including all characters, names, events, corporations, and situations, is entirely fictional and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story does not represent legal, financial, or relationship advice of any kind. All characters in this story are adults. All names used are fictional.